government's housing policies are absolutely failing young Canadians. The one thing to remember is that a development application or a plan to build housing isn't housing. When we need housing right now, and we let politics get in the way of building more housing, then leads to housing becoming more expensive and less accessible. The Canada Central Bank may actually be looking in towards a rate cut that may precipitate a little bit more of buyer activity and start pushing things more and more to a seller's market average for the composite index in the city of Toronto. We are looking just under 1.1 million at 1093 as an average. W04 encapsulates Weston, which we talk about a lot. The average price of a house there is $929,000. So we are talking about $165,000 savings over the overall average in the city of Toronto. Hey there, people. This is Joshua Jean-Baptiste, Toronto real estate broker, and you're watching episode 14 of the Under the Radar Real Estate Podcast. On today's show, we are following the same format as our last podcast. We are going to start off with the market update. We're going to dive into the City of Toronto real estate stats, and then we're going to dive right into some of the under-the-radar statistics that we like to follow, and then also look into some of the under-the-radar neighborhoods. And there's going to be a very similar theme to our past market updates. There's a couple of neighborhoods that keep bucking the trends here in Toronto that many people out there have got to keep an eye on. There's an old adage in real estate that you make money on the buy and not on the sell, and a lot of these under-the-radar neighborhoods is where you want to be looking. For our second segment, we are going to talk politics. No, we're not going to get into those kind of politics. We are going to talk about how the current government are completely turning their backs on younger generations and not actually listening to what young people need when it comes to housing in this country. A lot of young people are really angry and upset about what's going on in housing. And we're going to talk about the government's role in all this and how their decisions are going to impact young people's housing, not just now, but perhaps in the future. In the third segment, we are going to talk about the buying process. There's been a whole bunch of talks about what's happening in the US with certain lawsuits, really addressing buyer agency in the US. We are going to talk about how some of that may spill over to Canada. Now, in Canada, things work a little bit differently. I can't speak about all of Canada, but I know here in the city of Toronto and in Ontario, we have this thing called buyer agency. We're going to talk about how things work in the US, how it may affect things here, and what I think will likely change here in Toronto and in Canada based on what's happening in the US. So let's jump right into our first segment. Let's get into the market stats. So I'm going to pull them up right here. You're going to see them right here on the screen. So I'll quickly go over some of the general Toronto stats, so the stuff that you've likely seen reported, just to kind of give us some context as we get into some of the under the radar stats and the under neighborhoods, so we understand how everything kind of fits together in this puzzle. So let's jump into the year-over-year stats. So sales are down 4.5% over last year. It's been that trend for a while. No surprise there. New listings are up 15%. Active listings are up 23%. Very interesting stats to keep an eye on, and we're going to get to that in a moment when we go and talk about some of the under-the-radar statistics. Average price up 1.3% over last year, so relatively flat. I mean, pricing is starting to trickle upwards again. And then our average days on market is slightly higher than it was last year. Now I should put into context that all of these stats were from last month, from March 2023. It is now April. We are looking at what happened last month in the city of Toronto. So now we look at the city of Toronto specifics when it comes to pricing. So we'll look at detached houses were relatively flat at 0.4% up over last year. Semi-detached houses are pushing upwards. They were up 3% over last year. Townhouses almost up 3% as well. And condos were down at half point, so relatively flat. And that's for pricing specifically here in the 416. So all of those stats now should give us context as we move forward into some of the under the radar stats that we like to track on this channel. So for those of you who haven't followed this channel for a while or are just watching it for the first time, the two under the radar stats that we like to track that give us an idea of temperature in the market and give us some predictions on where things are likely going when it comes to pricing and sales in the city of Toronto. It also gives us an idea on where things are at right now. So the temperature of where we're going and where we're at. So those two stats, the first one is months of inventory. The acronym for that is MOI. And then the other stat is sales to new listings ratio, which the acronym for that is SNLR. So for the first one, for months of inventory, that stat just effectively captures what would happen if there were no new listings to hit the market from this point forward, how long it would take to sell off all of the inventory in the city of Toronto. And then when we look at sales to new listings ratio, this is the percentage of new listings that would sell in a given period of time. So to give you an idea of a balanced market for sales to new listings ratio, you're looking at about 50%. So 50% of all new listings that hit the market would sell within a given period of time. To give you an idea of like when the market was really hot, so what we saw in 2021 and 2022, sales to new listings ratio was well in excess of 70%. So over 70% of new listings that were hitting the market were selling almost right away. When we looked at when the market had slowed down last year and back in 2023, we saw sales to new listings ratio in some neighborhoods down in the 40%. So only 40% of new listings that were hitting the market were selling. So it kind of gives you an idea. 50% is kind of that baseline. Anything above that is hot. Anything below that is slow. So what we would call a buyer's market. So let's look at these numbers. Months of inventory. So in the city of Toronto, we are sitting at about 2.8 months of inventory. So again, to give you an idea in terms of balance, months of inventory balance market is at about 2.5. So when we look at the overall stats in the entire GTA, we are in a balanced market. So we're not in a buyer's market or a seller's market when we look specifically just at months of inventory. For the city of Toronto, we are slightly elevated at 2.8 months of inventory. However, when we look at the different areas and neighborhoods in the city of Toronto, you're going to quickly see, so if we look at the Toronto Central numbers, sitting at about 3.4 months of inventory, those central Toronto numbers are pulling the overall average higher. And a lot of that is due to the condo inventory. So condo inventory is still quite high in the city of Toronto, so it is pushing that months of inventory trend number up a little bit. If we were to remove condos, or if we look at some of the neighborhoods across the city of Toronto, so if we look in the West End and we look in the East End, you'll see there's a lot of neighborhoods that are trending well below that 2.5 months of inventory. And these are neighborhoods that don't have as much condo inventory. So we're seeing that when you're looking at freehold property in the city of Toronto, so that means houses, so that means detached houses, semi-detached houses, townhouses, the months of inventory is quite tight. So when we look at freehold housing in the city of Toronto, we are trending towards a seller's market. I mean, in most neighborhoods we're in a seller's market. However, when we look at condos are still very much in a buyer's market. If you watch some of our content from last month, I was screaming into the camera that we have a massive opportunity in the condo market. That opportunity still exists. There's still a lot of inventory and pricing is still a little depressed. So if you're looking for a condo, there's still an opportunity to get a condo at a slightly depressed price. And not only that, not a lot of competition. There's not a lot of competition in the condo market based on the amount of inventory we have. So if we look at I'm going to pick on one neighborhood. If we look at CO2, which is one of the central neighborhoods, we're sitting at 4.1 months of inventory. That's largely due to the condo product. So it would take 4 months for all of that condo product to sell off. Another neighborhood that's dominant in condos is CO8, 4.3 months of inventory, and then C12 at 6 months of inventory. So those three neighborhoods are well stocked with condo product, and there's a lot on offer. So if you're looking in those neighborhoods, no competition, very much a buyer's market. You can likely negotiate price on a lot of the product that's listed in those neighborhoods. Now, if we were to look at some of the under the radar neighborhoods, specifically. So if we look at W03, W04, and then we look at CO3, so for W03 sitting at 2.2 months of inventory, so trending towards the buyer's market. W04 is right in line with the overall Toronto average. W04, that's a little elevated because there is a lot of condo product in W04. W04 encapsulates Weston, which is what we talk about a lot on this channel. And there's a lot of new condo product in Weston, and as we all know, as I said, condo product hasn't caught up to freehold just yet, so it's pushing that number a little higher. And then same goes for CO3, sitting at 3.3 months of inventory. That's largely due to some of the condo product in that neighborhood that's pushing the months of inventory a little higher. Now, when we look at before we jump into sales to new listings ratio, we look out on the East End. East End is fully in a buyer's market. Their months of inventory as an average in the East End is 1.8. And I can tell you from experience, almost everything in the East End that gets listed for sale is getting snapped up quite quickly. And there is a lot of competition for homes in the East End of Toronto. Now, when we look at sales to new listings ratio, this stat gives you an idea of the kind of temperature of the market, right? So when a new listing hits the market, how quickly is it going to sell? Is it going to get snapped up right away, or is it going to move, or is it going to take a lot longer to move? So when we look at the sales to new listings ratio for the overall city of Toronto, we are sitting at about 44%. So as I said in the intro to this segment, 50% is kind of a balanced market. At 44%, that means we are still in a buyer's market overall. However, we are trending upwards when it comes to sales to new listings ratio. And then when we look at break down some of the neighborhoods, we look at the Toronto West neighborhood, we are just over 46%. In the East End, we are at 51% sales to new listings ratio. So as months of inventory already indicated, the East End is very much in a seller's market territory and keeps trending further and further deeper into that seller's market. Central Toronto, we are at just under 40%, 39.7% for sales to new listings ratio. Clearly, condo product isn't selling at the same rate as houses, and based on this statistic, it proves to be true, where only 40% of new listings that are hitting the market are selling, and that number is likely even lower if we were to back out a lot of the freehold product in these neighborhoods. Now this is just me purely speculating because I haven't actually run the calculation. Let me know down in the comments if you'd like me to break down that calculation. I could probably dig it up. But if I were to just kind of throw out a number, it's probably down in the low 30s of sales to new listings ratio if we were to back out freehold houses from that stat. So overall, when we look at these under the radar stats, it really just shows that while pricing is moving upwards in the city of Toronto, and if you talk to a lot of real estate agents, you'll say, hey, the market feels like it's heating up. It is. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that every single property that's hitting the market is getting a ton of interest and a lot of offers. Certainly that is happening in the cases of nice properties, especially on the freehold side. Freehold homes that look really well in really trendy neighborhoods that are priced well are getting a lot of attention. Condos and properties that may not necessarily be the bells of the ball aren't necessarily moving quickly and are taking a little bit longer to sell, which is showing that overall, when we take all these stats together, we put them together, we are likely in just a balanced market still right now, but we are trending towards seller's market. The East End is clearly already there, and the other neighborhoods in Toronto are playing catch up. And the condo market, while still very much in a buyer's market territory, is also starting to trend towards that seller's market. And then with the winds of change happening, i.e. the central bank rate announcement, there's a few articles floating out there that said that the Canada Central Bank may actually be looking in towards a rate cut before the U.S. Federal Central Bank has their rate cut. So that may precipitate a little bit more of buyer activity and start pushing things more and more to a seller's market if that were to happen in the near future. So now let's spin off and let's go to the under the radar neighborhoods in Toronto. analyze and just talk about why I keep talking about these specific neighborhoods and why I think there is a lot of value in these neighborhoods, especially when we look at the numbers, just straight up sales numbers and the overall price in some of these neighborhoods. So for the under the radar neighborhoods, as if you followed this podcast, you follow this channel, we like to look at the home price index for pricing because it's a bit more of a smoothed out version of the stats instead of using just average price. So I find with the HPI index, you get a more accurate picture of what the actual values are in the neighborhoods that we are going to be discussing in a minute. So first off, just to give you an idea of the difference between the average price and the HPI. Average price in the city of Toronto, earlier when we had it on screen, it was just over 1.1 million for average price. The average, I think it was exactly 1.121. For HPI, because it's a bit more smooth out average price, we are looking in the city of Toronto at just under 1.1 million, at 1093 as an average for the composite index in the city of Toronto. Now we look at some of the under the radar neighborhoods, so W03, W04, and C03. W03, the average price on the composite index is just over $1 million at $1,008,600, which represents about a $90,000 savings over the overall average in the city of Toronto. And then when we look at W04, the average price of a house there is $929,000, which represents a massive discount over the overall average in the city of Toronto. So we are talking about $165,000 savings over the overall average in the city of Toronto. I actually had some buyers looking in W04 just recently, just secured a house, and they looked out there because based on everything we were seeing in the city, we were looking at the East End, we were looking at some the trendier neighborhoods, and they weren't able to necessarily find what they wanted for sub $1 million in the city of Toronto. We looked out in West End, we found a 90s built townhouse, amazing shape, pretty much move-in condition for just under $900,000. So there's certainly some opportunities if you know where to look. And then when we look at CO3, the average is 1.7 million. But again, if you follow this channel, you know how we talk about the neighborhood of CO3, which is the neighborhoods of Oxon by Eglinton to the north. You have Dufferin on the west. Let's say about Avenue Road or Yonge Street in the east, and St. Clair in the south. So this kind of pocket of central Toronto. And this pocket is surrounded by some of the priciest neighborhoods in the city of Toronto, actually the priciest neighborhoods in Canada. So just north of there, you have Lawrence Park and Forest Hill. Just to the south, you have Wychwood. So while 1.7 million is quite a big number above the overall average in the city of Toronto, the one thing to remember is that this neighborhood is predominantly dominated by detached and semi-detached houses. There aren't a ton of condos in the neighborhood. And then if we were to compare it to the neighborhood just to the north of it, where the average is 2.2 million, you're looking at a $500,000 savings over the neighborhood literally a couple hundred meters north of it. So that's why, again, I call it an under the radar neighborhood, and it's under the radar for more the luxury buyers out there. So if you're looking for that higher end of the market, you're finding homes that are selling for under $2 million, where if you were to look just north of Eglinton into Lawrence Park and Forest Hill, this exact same home that would sell for, let's say, 1.9 million in CO3, when you get into CO4, for example, that exact same home is now all of a sudden 2.6 million. And you're getting a lot of the same neighborhood amenities in this neighborhood that you would in a Forest Hill and a Lawrence Park. And you're even getting into some similar school districts in terms of the demographics of these schools. So certainly an under the radar neighborhood worth keeping an eye on. And then when we look at the year-over-year change in some of these neighborhoods versus the city of Toronto. So in the city of Toronto, numbers were relatively flat. They were down 0.31% year over year, However, when we look at W03, the year-over-year average was up 3%. And then we look at W04, they were up only 0.22%, but that still represents about a 0.5% variance over the overall average in the city of Toronto. And then we look at CO3, this neighborhood, month after month, and I sit here on this podcast and I keep talking about it and I keep telling people, I only have a few hundred people that watch this podcast. I'd like to have a lot more. If you watch this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, because every month I sit here and I say, CO3 is the place you want to be investing your money in, because even during the depths of last year's market and into this year, CO3 keeps being that one neighborhood that continues to show year-over-year growth. So every month I'm looking at the numbers from CO3. So right now we're up 7% over last year. And that was last year when I kept showing CO3 as being an outlier. CO3 was always beating every other neighborhood in the city of Toronto, and it continues to beat every neighborhood in the city of Toronto in terms of price growth. You go up and down this list, there's even some of the neighborhoods in the East End that are very tight in terms of inventory, CO3 is still beating them. So if you had bought a house in CO3 last year, you're well ahead in terms of your overall, in terms of price growth, in terms of where you at last year versus this year. So CO3 continues to show a lot of growth. And a lot of that, again, is just due to the fact of where it's situated. If you are a young professional in the city of Toronto and you're looking for that entry-level luxury product, this is where you're looking, and a lot of people are looking there. And the reason why they're all looking here is that this area is so well situated and has a ton of brand new transit options moving there. It is going to be the new it neighborhood in the city. It's going to be the neighborhood that everyone wants to live in, everyone desires, and everyone aspires to live in. When you look at Oakwood Village is going through a renaissance similar to what we saw on Queen West, or similar to what we've seen on Dundas West or Ossington, where it's really becoming a cool spot with a whole bunch of new restaurants and shops opening along this strip. Get in now. That's all I can say. Get in now before things really change and you're going to be regretting not considering this neighborhood a lot sooner. So after watching this segment, if you're interested in buying, selling, renting in any one of the under the radar neighborhoods, or really anywhere across the city of Toronto, definitely hit us up. Calendly link is down below in the description. Book a call with us. We're more than happy to help you be your real estate resource in the under the radar neighborhoods we talk about, or anywhere here in the city of Toronto. Don't be afraid to hit us up. So on that note, let's pivot to segment 2. And it's a hard pivot into segment 2. We are talking about how government, and more specifically government's housing policies, are absolutely failing young Canadians. Now let's get a bit of a background on this. So when we look at the overall landscape here in Canada, and we understand the current market forces and what's driving real estate here in Canada. So we have a large cohort of brand new buyers here in this country, predominantly millennials. Millennials are no longer those young teenagers doing crazy things on the internet. Millennials now are actually, most of us are now in middle age. We have kids. We are at our peak earning potential for most of us. We are no longer those young whippersnappers who are just disrupting things online. We are now one of the more dominant economic classes here in this country, or at least we should be, especially when we look at previous generations. Most previous generations, when they hit their 30s and now into their 40s, that's when you hit your peak economic times as an adult, right? You're earning your highest earnings and you are purchasing your large properties and you're making big financial decisions all the time once you hit that age. However, we're now become that generation where we've had a lot of these false starts. We've gone through like multiple massive economic shocks in our adult lifetimes, right? We've gone through the 2008 crisis. We've gone through now COVID. We've seen massive spikes and drops in our housing market. And it seems like at every single turn, the government just really doesn't know how to address our needs, right? So the government is constantly, at least from our point of view, making policy decisions for older generations. And for a lot of you watching this, you probably share the same frustration I have. I mean, even some older generations who have children and offspring of my age in the late 30s, early 40s, you also feel frustration on behalf of your kids because you can't see them achieving the same things that you achieved at the same age. And a lot of this comes down to poor government policy. So right now we have this war going on in the country between the federal government and provincial governments over how they want to tackle the housing crisis. So to give you an idea of where we're at on the housing crisis, even prior to the pandemic, we were in a housing crisis. We simply just weren't building enough homes or had enough homes to satiate the amount of demand there was in the market. Now, you may go online and you may see some housing bears pull up stats and random figures and things saying like, oh, based on the amount of housing applications, there's more than enough in the pipeline to satiate demand. But the one thing to remember is that a development application or a plan to build housing isn't housing. We've seen housing developments be canceled all the time due to financing and other market forces. We've seen sometimes community groups absolutely take a building that was planned that was supposed to be 16 stories and had 200 units and completely neuter the project and say, you can't build this height here, you can't have this many units there. And it goes from this project where you'd have 200 family-sized suites to perhaps only having 100 tiny little micro apartments because the community fought it. Didn't want to have the height, didn't want to have the density in that neighborhood. Or I remember a few years ago, there was this article in the Toronto Star, I like to call them the density creeps from Yonge and Eglinton, where people were bemoaning a townhouse development that would have created a whole bunch of housing for young families and said this is not in the character of the neighborhood, which is a little funny because when I think Yonge and Eglinton, I actually think young families. But for whatever reason, the community there didn't want to have more young families in a community made for young families, and they completely neutered a development for young families and created these ultra luxury, super expensive townhouses that only a few select people could afford, and it had a much lower density. And I digress. We've had a lot of these issues in Canada, and specifically here in the city of Toronto and in the GTA for years and decades. And it seems like we've always had a housing crisis due to our lack of building. Now, there's some recent events that have exacerbated our housing crisis, like our immigration policy and so on and so forth. We're not going to get in here and talk about politics and about some of these factors, but we have to still address them. And they are factors that don't necessarily help the mess we're in. Right? So when we add a whole bunch of new residents to our country in quick order, and we don't have a plan to house these people, it just further compounds the housing crisis that we're already currently in. So even if we were to say we are not letting any other people into the country, we are still at a housing deficit, and just simply closing our borders doesn't solve anything overnight. So what is the government proposing then to solve some of our housing crisis? So we hear a lot of, and we can go through some of the public policy, and I'll quickly pull it up and let's put it on the screen right here because the government has actually put it out. And the federal government just announced yesterday, today is April 3rd, when we're recording this podcast. So just yesterday, for their upcoming budget, they announced some of the things that they are working on to help bring housing and help alleviate some of the pressures we have in our housing market. And there's a lot of great stuff in here, right? So they're talking about Housing Accelerator Fund. It's a $4.4 billion fund that plans to fast track 750,000 homes over the next decade, which is a big number, and it's certainly something that we need. And then they're going to top that up with a further 400 million to try and fast track an additional 12,000 over the next 3 years. Great. We need it. And then they're going to be launching the $6 billion Canada Housing Infrastructure Fund, which has now become this contentious thing. But first, let's just talk about what it's going to do. So it's going to give $1 billion for municipalities to help build the extra infrastructure that's going to be required to build more homes. So you have to upgrade infrastructure. You can't just add a whole bunch of new homes to a neighborhood and not actually serve it with all the utilities it's needed. They're also going to have $5 billion in agreements for provinces to support kind of some of their long-term priorities when it comes to housing. So, like, for example, some of the things they mentioned here is require municipalities to adopt as of right missing middle homes. So missing middle, for those of you who don't understand what that is, missing middle are things like duplexes and triplexes, townhouses, and small condominium complexes. So kind of under 6-story condominium. So things that you can build swiftly. Missing middle. Missing middle, we talk about it from a scale standpoint and how it scales well into cities. But the other thing that I think is not talked about enough is that you can build missing middle quickly. They are easy to build and they're quick to build if you're allowed to build them. So that's what they're going to try and push municipalities to allow this type of housing and allow it to be built quickly and easily with not a lot of friction. They also want to propose implementing a 3-year freeze on increasing development charges, which is great. The key here is increasing development charges, not eliminating development charges. But either way, it's something that we do need. And I'll get back to that point in a second. Other things like require as-of-right construction of government house design catalog. Now, that house design catalog is from post-war. I don't know how much, especially when we look at the city of Toronto, that doesn't really help us here, building small little detached houses on whatever land we have left in the city, which isn't much, unless if they plan to pave over parks, which I hope never happens. But anyhow, doesn't apply to Toronto, but I'm sure it applies to many other municipalities throughout our country. And there's other things like the Home Buyers Bill of Rights and the Renters Bill of Rights that they've imposed. We'll get into that in I think we'll have an entire whole other podcast or video on the Homeowners Bill of Rights and Renters Bill of Rights. There's a lot of, but there's also a lot of other resources online. One person you should actually follow who covers a lot of these topics quite well is Daniel Foch. Go follow him. He gets into the nitty-gritty on both these topics, and he probably does a better job of explaining it than I would. And then it goes on to mention that based on this massive amount of funding that's going to go towards municipalities, they have until January 1st of 2025 to secure this agreement. Also, a few other things that they're attaching to this housing plan is that they want to eliminate mandatory minimum parking when you're within 800 meters of a transit node. You're allowing high density housing, again, within 800 meters of those transit nodes. Also allow high density, and all these things are as of right, allow high density housing within 800 meters of post-secondary. And there's a whole bunch of other things like this within there, but these are the main key highlights of this plan, and I think it's all needed. Now, where the friction comes, so the federal government proposed actually a pretty good plan, but now, because we have premiers who may not be of the same political stripe of some of these, of the federal party, we are seeing now friction. And not all of this has to do with necessarily what the federal government has proposed. This is politics right now. So a lot of the premiers right now in a lot of provinces are upset with things like the carbon tax. Right? So they're going to say, we are not going to agree to this because we don't believe on your stance on carbon tax. So they are going to sacrifice additional funding for building based on something else that has really nothing to do with, or very little to do with the housing market. I know the carbon tax does affect the housing market in some ways, but it's not a direct correlation. And we shouldn't be holding up housing based on carbon tax. And then there's also just simple things when it comes to very granular issues. So right here in the province of Ontario, we have Doug Ford, who came out saying he is against fourplexes as of right, for example, in the province, because Doug Ford and some of his NIMBYist policies and some of his NIMBY cronies in his party believe that you shouldn't have a fourplex in an established neighborhood because they have these twisted ideas of what a fourplex is. They think it's, for some reason, a massive apartment structure that you're going to plop down in the middle of a neighborhood, which is not that at all. But again, because Doug Ford has twisted views of what a fourplex is, he is saying no to this additional funding and no to this additional housing because of whatever false narratives go around having multiplex housing in neighborhoods. So with that, again, we keep getting to these forks in the road when it comes to housing, when we need housing right now, and we argue over ridiculous things and we let politics get in the way of building more housing, which then leads to housing becoming more expensive and less accessible. We need housing right now. And one thing I'll actually kind of go after, I actually wrote down some notes. I mean, one of the major things that is missing from this announcement, so this announcement, while it's great for the bigger picture of housing in Canada, it doesn't address some of the things that we need right now. While the multiplex thing is great, and I think it's great on the surface, but it's clearly creating political friction. There's other things that we can do to kind of help bring multiplexes to the cities that need them right now, because you can build duplex and triplex and fourplexes quickly. One thing that should have been included in this bill is some type of incentive for current owners to turn their single family homes into multiplexes. So if you are an empty nester, for example, and you have a 2,000, 3,000 square foot house and you're living there as a couple or by yourself, and you only keep a couple of bedrooms open for your adult kids to come and visit once in a while, and you have all this extra space, the government should actually create either like a tax savings or a tax-free savings account or a tax-free loan or different types of zero interest loans for homeowners to be able to access capital or get a tax rebate to create a multiplex out of a home that already exists. We can build that really, really quickly. And not only that, it creates tons of more construction jobs. Because all of a sudden, if there's a whole bunch of demand by people taking single family homes, turning them into duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, you have a ton more construction jobs. And a lot more small scale home builders can get now into the business of building these types of homes or renovating homes for current homeowners. So that should be something that's included as a part of this. Actual incentives to get people to build, not just a ruling that says, hey, we want you to allow these things to get built. Great. Allowing something to get built doesn't mean it's going to get built. There's a lot of things that people are allowed to do that they simply don't do. You have to incentivize people to do it. And that's the big thing that I believe is actually missing from this. And then when we talk about development charges, in a city like Toronto, development charges are super onerous. They are brutal. A lot of the times when we look at like a 2-bedroom condo in the city of Toronto, you're paying $120,000 plus in development charges alone to build one of these units. The government should actually be looking at rebating that either at 50%, 75%, or even 100% over a 2 to 3 year span and say, hey, for the next few years, zero development charges on building more housing because we need to get more housing built quickly, right? So instead of saying, hey, we're going to cap development charges, say, let's eliminate building the development charges for X amount of years and rebate municipalities who do rely on some of those development charges to build more infrastructure. But in this bill, it shows that municipalities will be getting more money anyhow for extra infrastructure investment. So how do we say, hey, eliminate development charges for the next 3 to 5 years so we can bring more housing to the market quickly? So ultimately, if there's anyone from the government who's watching this, or if one of you people watching this video and you know someone in government, you know people in government, please tell them that please, they have to stop bickering about what type of weird bureaucratic policies they want to institute to address the housing market and actually address the housing market by getting things built. We need to build more housing now to solve our housing crisis. And I know this sounds rich coming from a realtor saying, hey, build more houses. But truthfully, that's what we need when we look at simple economics, supply and demand. We have a supply-demand issue right now, and there's a lot of demand, very little supply, so we have to create more supply to satiate the demand and also control some of this the economics of house prices completely out of whack, and it's primarily just due to our supply-demand constraints. We're seeing house prices start to go back up again here in the city of Toronto, and that's without a rate cut. We are still paying really high lending rates, and house prices are starting to move upwards again after we saw them go down when rates went up. Because all that happened is that people sat on the sidelines for 6 months and not bought, they jumped into the rental market or whatever, or they were living with parents or family, friends, whatever, waiting for rates to come back down. And eventually they got to a point where we can't wait anymore. We have to get back into the market. And now we're seeing houses start to sell at a decent clip again, house pricing starting to go up, and that's without a rate cut. So what happens when rates are cut again? We need to build more housing now, and governments need to stop playing these dumb political games and actually start building houses, because this is absolutely ridiculous. It's getting to a point where most young people, truthfully, I didn't want to turn this into a political podcast, but most of us actually don't even have political parties that we can vote for, because truthfully, every single politician's housing plan is complete garbage, and it's nothing that any of us can vote for. So if any politicians are watching this, it's time to actually step up to the plate and actually start building some freaking houses and stop these games. All right. So after my little rant, there's no easy way to jump into this next topic. And if any of this next topic might seem a little bit dry compared to what we just talked about, and clearly it pisses me off, that last topic. So let's jump into something else and let's end this podcast on a bit of a smoother note. It's not really that smooth, it's still a pretty heavy topic as well, but let's get into it. So let's talk about buyer agency. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. When many of you who aren't in the real estate industry, you're seeing a whole bunch of a massive change actually that's happening in the US, just south of us, when it comes to buyer agency. So let's talk about a little bit of context of buyer agency. So let's first go over what buyer agency is. So if you are looking to buy a house in North America, and this is it's very much a North American concept, because when we go into other countries, they don't really have buyer agency. Generally, if you sell a house, you list the house, and then you either negotiate directly with the seller or the seller's agent to buy that house. You actually won't have your own representative represent you on the buy. In North America, we actually have a bit of a different model where we have buyer's agents. So when you're looking for homes, you will call up a real estate agent and say, hey, I need you to help me buy a house, and the buyer's agent will do all the work necessary to help you buy a house. Now that's a very broad overview of what a buyer's agent is. Now, when we look at what's happening in the US, they have buyer agency, but they never really most states in the US never really formalized buyer agency in the law or in any type of agreement. So the idea was, when you hired an agent, the agent, once they helped you find a home, it would be understood that the seller of that home would be paying the buyer's agent fees for helping the buyer buy the home, right? So the sellers felt like they were forced into these scenarios where they had to pay the buyer's agent a fee, and there was no way to necessarily negotiate that fee. They felt whenever they were negotiating, they were just negotiating the selling agent's fee, and there was nothing they could do to negotiate the buyer's agent fee. So whatever fee that was set, and I think in the US was quite high, like 3%, they just thought that was something you had to pay, and there was no way of getting out of it. And because in many states there wasn't any actual documentation around buyer agency, they just thought it was something you had to do, and that was it. So the government stepped into the US to say, hey, this seems like unfair practices. and you can no longer force sellers to pay a specified fee. So what they had to do then in the US is remove anything when it came to the amount of money that a buyer's agent would receive for showing that property. And they have a few other rules, but that's the gist of what's going on there right now. So ultimately, while it feels like a huge bombshell, I mean, they're likely still going to go to a scenario where buyer's agents will still get paid, but I think a few things will change, right? So sellers will actually have a little bit more say in negotiating how much they want to pay the buyer's agent. Now, when we look at here in Canada, we have a similar system, but it's a little different. And I mean, I don't know about the rules right across Canada, but at least here in Ontario, we have what we call a buyer's agency form. So when buyers are working with an agent, you actually have to sign a form saying you are going to be represented by the agent. And then within that form, it actually details what the buyer's agent is required to do, some of their fiduciary duties. And this is something that in the US they didn't really have. So here, when we had a buyer's agreement, we would explain with the buyer all the different things we have to do in our different fiduciary duties, right? So like when we're representing a buyer, we are representing their interests. So we're not sharing any confidential information that they don't want us to share with the seller, for example. There's a lot of other things. If we get into a multiple representation scenarios where the seller and buyer are represented by the same brokerage, we have to notify them, and we have to do our best to ensure that both sides are represented fair and equitably. There's a few other things in our buyer agency agreement when it comes to remuneration, right? If we are going to receive any bonuses or any type of money from, let's say, a mortgage broker that refers us over, or a different lender or a home inspection company, anything, if we're getting any type of extra remuneration, we have to notify the buyer, let them know of those things. So there's a lot of things in our buyer representation agreement that we would have to go over with a buyer, and they'd have to sign this agreement. And in the agreement, there's also a section on commission that actually details how much commission we are likely to receive as a part of the transaction. So it's not necessarily an opaque process, because it's actually something that we must discuss with our buyers when they're signing this contract. So for example, in my case, when I sign a buyer representation agreement, generally with my buyers, what it'll state in terms of commission is that in most cases, the customary commission for a buyer's agent in Toronto is 2.5%. So I would generally write into the buyer's agreement that 2.5% is generally what my brokerage will collect in terms of commission. It'll then get dispersed based on the breakdown of how I split with my brokerage. But then I'd also add in all of my agreements something that, or if the seller isn't willing to pay the 2.5%, I will take whatever they're offering me on MLS, because in some cases, sellers are not offering 2.5%, and I'm not going to require my buyers to come up with that additional if there is a variance between the 2.5% or what's indicated on MLS. I state it's that my fee is generally 2.5% or whatever is indicated on MLS, and I'm not going to ask my buyers to top that up or whatever. So if a seller is only going to offer 2%, that's what I'll take as a fee. If the seller is only going to offer 1.5%, that's what I'll take as a fee. If the seller is going to offer 4%, that's what I'll take as a fee. So that's generally how I would structure my buyer's agreements. But the difference here in Canada, we are structured a little differently than the US, and our buyers generally have a little bit more information on how we are compensated for our services. Now, you will see that there are some lawsuits that are about to go through the Canadian courts that are very similar to the ones in the US. Now, the lawsuits that are here in Canada aren't as much of a slam dunk as the ones in the US. I mean, a lot of times people like to copycat what happened there. And because things are a little bit different than the way they work in the US, I don't think we'll necessarily have the same outcome. But I do think some changes will come because we do have an industry that does lack transparency. If you follow our channel, if you look at some of our previous videos, we are talking about a lot of the practices that happen within real estate that really aren't transparent, and there has to be some more transparency in our processes. So what I'm actually hoping is that the Canadian real estate institutions recognize this, and instead of waiting for a judge's decision, perhaps be a little bit proactive on some measures to bring more transparency to our industry. There's a lot of things when it comes to blind bidding, or when it comes to transparency around disclosing sold prices, and all of these other things where there's a lot of opaque processes. Just make them more transparent in advance. Send an olive branch. Show, hey, we are trying to be more transparent. Another thing that's likely going to come out of this is actually showing what the buyer brokers will earn in terms of commission, right? We may get to a day where buyers and sellers can actually see what the commission rates are, because right now when they go on MLS, it's not something you can see, right? So it might actually be something where you have to advertise or actually show what the commission what the overall commission may be on a particular home, or at least say somewhere on the massive realtor sites what customary commissions are, so people understand what's happening in the market. And it's not something where it seems like it's an undercurrent, because there's not really, unless if you Google what does the average real estate commission look like in the city of Toronto, and you may find a blog somewhere that explains what it is, there should actually be some type of chart showing like, hey, this is what the customary commission is, so people understand what that is, and actually get out there and be a bit more of a transparent industry, because a lot of our stuff we do is just simply opaque, and we need to start being more transparent as agents. And then I think what'll happen, especially from an agent standpoint, is we're gonna have to be a lot more clear about what we do as real estate agents. Because I mean, if you go on TikTok and Instagram, you'll see a lot of videos of people being like, agents trying to justify what they do. And some of the videos are funny, but there is a lot of truth to that, because I think sometimes people will watch TV shows online like House Hunters or Selling Sunset, and it just looks like agents, all we do is just sit in coffee shops and chat, take phone calls, and drive fancy cars and open doors. But most of us, we do a lot more than that, and a lot of the times it's very unglamorous work. And I think what we'll have to do as an industry is really detail that in our buyer representation agreements and actually explain all the different things we do. Similar to when you retain a lawyer will send you a document and show all the different services they do, and you see all the different costs, like when they have to staple a page and you pay 10, 15 bucks for them to staple something. But I think we'll have to do a similar breakdown to show all the different things we do to actually show the average consumer of what we do as an agent, to kind of get them to understand what an agent does to be able to earn the amount of money that they earn on a potential transaction, right? And all of these things should help to bring a lot more clarity to the industry and start bringing a lot more trust to the industry as a whole. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, but I actually am just advocating for our real estate industry to kind of get out ahead of some of these things and start to become a little bit more transparent with a lot of the processes, and start to work on this now instead of having a judge force us to do anything. So that about wraps it up. Episode 14 of the Under the Radar Real Estate Podcast. We got into the market update. We talked about how the government is absolutely turning its back on millennials and the younger generation when it comes to housing. We got animated, we got upset, and we just don't want any. We don't want any of it anymore. We're done with the political games. We just need more houses. And then we talked about buyer agency. It's a topic that has been floating around. We addressed it from my point of view, what I think is going to happen, what I think we can do to actually promote change in our industry. And hopefully we'll start seeing a little bit of change. And any of you who are watching this video, we'd love to hear your comments. What do you think about the market, where we're at in terms of pricing, some of the under the radar neighborhoods? Is it a place you'd want to live, a place you want to buy, rent, sell? Let us know down in the comments. With the hot button topic of government and their approach to housing, we would love to see the comments on that, because I think a lot of people probably share my frustration with the government. So I know it's a hot button item and it might light up our comment section, but I'd love to see it. Love to see the comments. Love to see if you agree or disagree, or just all the different angles that maybe we missed, and maybe we can address in another video another day on this channel. And then lastly, buyer representation. That's another hot button topic. Love to hear what you think about buyer representation, how it might change, how you think the government here will deal with a lawsuit that's going to go before the Canadian courts, and what you think of buyer agency here in North America. Will it change? Will we go more towards a European model, or will we stay in our current model and we'll just see a few changes? Anyway, love to see all the comments. Anyway, we would love to see all of your comments and all of your feedback. And then again, remember to like and subscribe if you like the content that you just watched. Please share it with anyone else that you think might be interested in these topics in real estate, or if looking to buy, sell, or rent in the city of Toronto or any of our under the radar neighborhoods. We'll be more than happy to help you out. So that about wraps it up. And as always, what we like to say at the end of every video, in real estate, as in life, the next big thing might just be where you least expect it. So stay positive, stay on the ball. Peace out.